Hi there, I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. Our topic is Your API Will Get Compromised. Here's why, how, and what you actually do. Stop it. Your speaker today is Katie Paxton Fear. She's Principal Security Research Engineer with Traceable by Harness. And before I invite her onto our virtual stage here, let me give you some background on our session today. APIs are the hidden infrastructure that makes modern technology possible. You use one every day, even if you don't realize it. And even if your teams are not making APIs, they are probably still consuming them, taking advantage of the ease with which they connect organizations, partners, and teams. But with this gift of accessibility comes real attack risks. APIs handle sensitive data, core business processes, and valuable assets wrapped up in an easy-to-use interface in your infrastructure or a partner or supplier. Perfect for developers or the would-be attacker. In this talk, we will cover API security's what, why, how, and when, and you will be received of some real practical advice, even if you're struggling with a budget. I think you'll enjoy this session today. Bit of background on my organization. Information Security Media Group is a global education and intelligence firm. We are based in the U.S. in Princeton, New Jersey, and of course, you may know us by any number of our 38 media properties. They include Bank Info Security, Data Breach Today, AItoday.io. In all, we serve an audience of over 1.2 million security and technology leaders globally and give them a daily diet of news, analysis, research, events, and educational programs just like this one. Few notes of housekeeping. If you have any questions for Katie anytime during this session, you may submit them by the chat window on your screen. I may not be able to get to every question, but in that case, if we can't answer your question today, we will get a response back to you via email. Should you encounter technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please write down the email address you see on the screen. If you write to webinars@ismg.io, we have got support staff standing by to help you. And a reminder, today's webinar is copyrighted material meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you would like to use any of the information presented today, or if you're looking for customized training materials, please contact us. Let us meet our sponsor today, starting with Harness. Harness is a leading end-to-end platform for complete software delivery. It provides a simple, safe, and secure way for engineering and DevOps teams to release applications into production. Harness uses AI and machine learning to monitor the quality of deployments and automatically roll back failed ones, saving time and reducing the need for custom scripting and manual oversight, giving engineers their nights and weekends back. Harness customers accelerate deployments by up to 75%, reduce infrastructure costs by up to 60%, and decrease lead time for changes by up to 90%. Harness is based in San Francisco, and you can learn more at harness.io. Meanwhile, Traceable by Harness has got an intelligent and context-aware solution that powers complete API security, API discovery and posture management, API security testing, attack detection and threat hunting, and attack protection anywhere your APIs live. Traceable by Harness enables organizations such as Axos Bank, Informatica, Bullish to minimize risk and maximize the value that APIs bring their customers. Traceable by Harness is backed by industry-leading investors, including Unusual Ventures, IVP, and Citi Ventures. To learn more, visit traceable.ai. And now let us meet Katie Paxton Fear. She's an API security expert, principal API security researcher at Traceable by Harness. In her words, she used to make APIs, and now she breaks them. And with that, let's bring on to our virtual stage here, Katie Paxton Fear. Katie, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited.
Well, Katie, in a previous conversation, you referred to API security as plumbing. I want you to dive into that image, please.
Well, I always think of APIs like plumbing because they are the kind of infrastructure that makes the world work, but it's mostly invisible to us. Like the same way you don't think about, what happens where that water out your tap actually comes from. It's the same for APIs. We don't think about where the data we're using comes from. It's just kind of there. And so I always like the like I always like think about it like plumbing, because we don't notice plumbing and our infrastructure until something goes wrong. And it doesn't matter whether or not, you're an expert plumber or you've just come home and your house is flooded. The problem is still there. And I think a lot of organizations risk taking their APIs kind of for granted and their API security, because actually, these are critical infrastructure to businesses that organizations may not even know they have. There may be third-party suppliers they don't even know about. Look at where we're seeing, AI going now. Every AI-based app is an API. Everything is APIs. We just don't really hear a lot about them.
Well, because everything is APIs, they're certainly in the adversary's crosshairs. What are the types of predominant attacks you're seeing against APIs today?
Oh, it's a really good question. I think one of the kind of key differences with APIs versus, other types of security risks, things like ransomware, for example, is that API attacks are much more targeted to an organization. It's never the case that it's necessarily opportunistic. It's usually well-researched attacks. It's attacks that, for the most part, take place over really long periods of time. These are not a get in there and get out kind of attacks. These are like very well researched. They're very context driven by what an organization does. So if you're an e-commerce business, you're going to see payment attacks. If you are providing, maybe an API as a service, you're going to see more bot attacks. So they are really, really targeted. And certainly when we look at the kind of threat actors, they're very sophisticated. They know an organization's APIs better than the organization does, and certainly know that more of them exist. And I think really that kind of highly motivated attacker who really understands the value of the information that your organization has and processes, that makes API attacks really, really different. And one of the other key differences when it comes to other types of security attacks is that APIs are kind of the universal attack vector. You can get in through an API. You do not need to understand like tons of different systems, tons of different network layers, whatever controls are in place. There is just an open door. All you need is the ability to walk through it. And so we're seeing APIs being more and more targeted. And especially, again, now I'm going to use AI as an example. Every AI based app is using an API probably to say OpenAI's, GPT models, maybe to the Google API to get Gemini. That is also APIs. And think about AI agents, they're also interacting with the world through APIs. And I think that really some of these attacks are only going to get more and more common, especially as we see AI become more and more a fixture in our daily lives. So those are the kind of key differences. Very common, and when they attack, they know how to cause damage.
Okay, to double click on this a little bit, who are the attackers and why do they tend to be, as you say, extra motivated to succeed?
Oh, it's a really good question. I think this comes a lot from the kind of wider trends we're seeing, especially when it comes to ransomware gangs, where we can really identify individual gangs who are launching campaigns. So just this past few days, the UK has had the retail sector hit very hard from ransomware, and it's very targeted. It's the same group that hits multiple different organizations or businesses in roughly the same way using the same attacks. Now, APIs, on the other hand, the attackers we see on APIs are not usually gangs. Can be in terms of bots. We think about, maybe the hottest Nike shoe drops, and you've got people trying to buy those shoes as quickly as possible so they can resell them on the secondary market for a lot more money. Like they tend to be quite organized, but overall API security attacks aren't, well-known threat groups necessarily. That's not to say we don't see well-known threat groups abusing APIs. We certainly do, but a lot of API attacks end up being quite distinct. And I think this is why it's kind of challenging for organizations, because it's a lot easier when there are really clear, this IP address has come from Russia, therefore it's bad, and we know it's bad. In API land, you can't really trust that. You can't say, well, that IP address is in Russia, so it must be bad, because APIs can be consumed all over the world. And so we don't see these really clear boundaries. I mean, for the most part, when it comes to who the attackers are, they have chosen their target deliberately. They are using attacks that target the kind of core of what that organization does. Usually, they are motivated by exfiltrating data out of an organization, and or financial motivation. So we don't really get this really clear profile of who these attackers are, because they really can be anyone, and it's really hard to profile everything from, maybe a teenager based in the US to a gang that is, say, doing fraud on a really wide scale. Both of them can buy the same Nike shoes, but one is obviously a lot more organized than the other is, but it's not, they can both do it.
Well, you can profile the victims because you see lots of them. What would you say are the biggest gaps that you uncover in API security? Probably visibility is a huge one.
Visibility is, I mean, it is the number one problem. I always use an example. I go to a lot of bug bounty hunting events. That's where you find vulnerabilities in software and then you get paid for what you find. And in every one of these events, there is always one reward, and it's the we didn't know about it award. So this is awarded to a hacker who can find an asset or find a vulnerability in an asset that the organization had no idea was public, that they didn't even know they had in the first place. They don't know who developed it. They don't know where it's come from. They don't know who's deployed it, nothing. I have never, ever seen that prize be unclaimed at one of these events. It doesn't matter if you're investing millions into your security program or you're just starting out, there is always going to be, shadow IT assets that you have no idea about. With APIs, it's particularly challenging because APIs are very developer-led products. A lot of the time, APIs are motivated by, oh, I need a way to access this data. And while I'm developing it, I'm just going to have it return all the data. And then later on, I'll decide which ones I actually want to keep. And they never change it. So the API goes live with a lot of data, which should be fine because your security team should notice the deployment. Well, this is an API. It doesn't go through the normal deployment mechanisms. It goes through another pipeline. So your security team doesn't know about it. And this is, I think, the biggest problem with APIs. It's just they are made by developers for developers, like deployed by developers. And it's also hard to tell developers, hey, this is insecure. You can't have this. We're kind of getting in their way a lot. And I think that's another kind of big challenge in API security is how do you get developers on board with doing security when this is kind of their child, their baby. They don't want to, they have a genuine need for it. And so those are kind of main key issues. Though I will say the other kind of key thing I see all the time is access control. Just having an API that allows you to do too much. Every single time I test an API for security vulnerabilities, without fail, I will find access control vulnerabilities. I will find data I'm not supposed to see, or maybe I'll be able to access a function that should be off limits, or I'll be able to access an admin function as a regular user, that they are very, very common. And they're really hard to test for as well, by the way. These are not easy vulnerabilities that you can pick up with an off-the-shelf WAF. These are vulnerabilities that require understanding what an application does, context, how it's developed. It's not an easy solution.
So, Katie, over the past decade, I certainly have seen API security awareness grow within organizations, but why would you say some of the traditional approaches to API security have fallen short?
Now, APIs are fundamentally at their core just web applications. It's not anything special. However, the typical kind of application security controls you might put on, say, a more traditional web application with a user interface just don't work for APIs. It just doesn't work. It's not designed for the kind of data that APIs handle. It focuses on things like client-side vulnerabilities. And then honestly, it's really hard to find API endpoints as well. Just finding out where those APIs exist is challenging in the first place. And so I think it's kind of twofold. One is that these tools were never meant for APIs. We are trying to use, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Even a screw. But actually, you need a screwdriver. You need something that actually fits into that API and understands it from that API first, API native approach. And on the other side, the challenge around visibility, it's how do you actually begin to understand your API attack surface? Again, it's so rooted in what an API does, and because the APIs aren't easily, you can't navigate through an API. There's no links. You can't just tick off every single link on a page. There's no way of downloading an entire API. It's just not designed for it. And I think really when it comes to, why traditional security doesn't work, it kind of does work to a point. And then unfortunately, you get to that point with APIs and actually then you can't do anything more. Like then you're in a situation where, this is as good as it can get until you look at like API specific security controls. Though I will say one of the biggest changes I've seen over the past like 5 years in APIs is a real focus on like secure defaults. There are a lot more advice now, a lot more pieces of advice on places like Stack Overflow and developer forums and other places where those secure configurations are kind of set up by default. And that does make it a little bit more challenging for attackers. Even if you later go and like buy API security solution or whatever, that gives you a good starting point and actually doesn't cost anything as well.
Good segue to talk about Traceable by Harness. Katie, how are you helping your customers tackle API security at a different depth?
So, Traceable by Harness is a complete API security platform. So, many of our customers come to us hoping we can solve one problem for them. And that is, I don't know what APIs I have. The first thing to really understanding your risk in a business is to understand what you have. And with APIs, they're developed by developers, they are run by developers. Security teams have no visibility into them. The kind of reason why a lot of customers come and speak to us is, first of all, like, I have all of these assets that I have no idea about. I don't know where they are. I don't know where they're being used. I don't know who's deploying them. I don't know which development team is doing this. That's kind of where a lot of our customers start out. And once they have that visibility, they can begin to understand risk. So Traceable produces a risk score. You can actually edit the score as well, like based on your own like what you consider sensitive. You can generate a risk score. You can give each API a number on how insecure it is. And starting at the most insecure, you can work your way down and see whether or not, okay, yeah, this needs a security control, or this needs something else, or I need to know the developer for this, or I need to find out who owns this. Now, once our customers get a handle on their APIs, once they have an idea of what their API attack surface looks like, then they go into either our API security testing. So before APIs are ever made public, testing for specific API security vulnerabilities that no other scanner can really pick up very easily. Or they go and they go into our API protection. API protection sits basically in front of your API and looks for security attacks and then blocks them or alerts you or feeds into your existing CM or SOAR or SOC tools that people are already using. We integrate really well with a multi-cloud environment. We integrate really well with things like API gateways. We integrate well with developer tools. It's kind of a all-in-one solution that starts with you actually figuring out your API attack surface and can get you to, hey, automatic when this API endpoint goes live, or when any API goes live, I want to run these specific tests in this specific order. It's going to fail on X, Y, Z, whatever. And if they ever is attacked in production and it's a vulnerability that maybe you didn't test for, or whatever, you can detect that, respond to it, and ensure that the next API breach doesn't happen.
Any favorite success stories you like to share?
So my favorite story is from a customer. And it's kind of a fun story. I don't know it's because I'm a technical person and therefore I love a technical story, but I will use this as my example. So, as part of what we do, we often look at our clients' data and traffic to kind of understand what kind of security attacks that they're facing. It really helps, and we give that knowledge back to the community. We are very keen. We share a lot on our security research side, and we speak a lot at conferences. So we try and go into that customer data, find those learnings that would be relevant outside of customers as well, and present them to the public. So we were looking through some customers' traffic, and there was a lot of anomalous traffic. Now, this is not necessarily traffic that is malicious, and it wasn't outwardly malicious. It wasn't a case of this is a security vulnerability, it's here, I can point to it, it's an SQL injection. It was more patterns of activity on this API. It's a little bit weird. While we do see some, repeating patterns, think about the idea of you may be checking your bank statement. You're going to go to your bank's website, you're going to log in, you're going to, go to your account. That is a very clear, when you check your statement, you go through step 1, 2, 3, 4. And when we were looking at this client's data and we were comparing it to kind of what we expected from some of their other traffic, we could really see how anomalous it was. So we go and investigate. And what we find is a really long running attack. Like, I'm talking over months, over potentially years, that essentially was testing out bank accounts to see if they had any money in it. It's fundamentally what the attack was. We found out while doing this investigation that 80% of traffic to this API was just bots checking for this, using the business logic of an application to determine whether or not an account had money in it. 80%. And that was, I think, really, really shocking and surprising for us, because think about, how much the cloud compute cost would be for that. You're paying, 80% more fees for traffic that is just malicious traffic. And so we took this and we were like, I wonder if that affects other customers. So we took this research and we applied it to another customer in a similar sector. And lo and behold, we saw the same pattern of activity, checking for bank accounts. And we realized that this wasn't just one single attack. This was multiple attacks over multiple of our customers. This being an established pattern across 2 of our customers, I wonder how long it actually been going on for. And certainly this wasn't something that got flagged up from traditional security methods. This isn't something where there was a big glaring, alert fired, alert, alert, alert. This was subtle. It was designed to be undetectable. It was supposed to go without notice for years. This is not an attack someone conducts over a weekend. This is a planned, methodical, targeted attack.
I want to come back to something we talked about up front. How can enterprises tackle this API security challenge, even if they lack sufficient budget?
So I always say, any API security program, any security program really, is not about throwing away everything you have. Think about it like a desk setup. On your desk, you probably have, like most people do, paper everywhere, post-it notes, random smart devices, maybe multiple keyboards, multiple monitors. If you're tidying your desk, you don't just throw away all of your monitors. You don't just, rebuy everything. You tidy up what you have. And regardless of whether or not your security budget is, 0 at the moment for APIs, or, you've got money to spend, simply tidying up what you already have can make a huge change. So my recommendation really for what does best in class API security look like? Well, one, where your APIs are. You have a good sense of who's deploying them. You have a full API inventory. You have risk scores for all of your APIs. When a new API is being deployed, you get an alert about it. Two is that you have some kind of executive alignment on API security being important. Quite often, API security is kind of thought about quite like far in people's AppSec journeys, but actually you can just, say, hey, this is a priority now and get that executive buy-in. You don't need their wallet. You need their like buy-in and to make sure they know it's important. Having automatic protection and testing in place for APIs, specifically for API security attacks, having a detection suite that can flag API security attacks with automatic blocking or alerts your existing SOC, whatever that looks like, and you have some kind of recovery in place. That's what top tier API security looks like. Most people don't have that, but it's not that hard to get there. So, good API security looks like doing literally anything. Most organizations do nothing about API security. Simply coming to this webinar and learning about API security, you have done more than 90% of organizations have. And I think that's really important because, most people completely ignore it. You don't necessarily need specialist tools or a large budget initially, but you do need to do something. Tools like Traceable help. Of course, they help. We make it easy. This is a case of, you can download a bunch of open source tools, pull it all together, make it someone's full-time job. Just do that and manage that suite of tools, or you can pay for it if you have the budget. Tools help. It is not necessary though. First step for any organization embarking on this is you've got to know where your APIs are. Now, if you buy an API specific security tool like Traceable, we can automatically find your APIs for you. If you don't, what you can do is you can bring a box of donuts to your developer team and be like, hey, can you tell me a bit about our API infrastructure? And people go straight to like tools by. Actually, donuts are a lot cheaper than any API security tool will ever be, and they're great for bribes for your development teams.
Well, when you become traceable by Krispy Kreme, we know you have arrived.
That would have been that'll be my new role, will be delivering donuts to security teams. So once you have an idea of that API attack surface, you don't need to find everything. Just the most critical assets at the start is fantastic, because that is what's going to probably be targeted anyway. And then the second thing you can do is find out who owns them. You do not need to take full control off a developer. And I actually recommend you don't, especially if you've got a small security team, because developers you can use as your like force multiplier, right? You can have them be the little security people of their own projects. My suggestion is for every API you find one responsible developer, either because they've made it in the first place, or they've deployed it, or just because you're going to assign it to them and say, hey, if I have any problem with this API, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to use your expertise about this API. Changing it to be less of a security team talking down to developers saying no, bad developer, don't produce security vulnerabilities, and moving towards okay, if I do have a problem, I'm going to come to you because you're the expert, I'm not the expert, you are, produces a very different kind of environment for collaboration between security team and developers. So I really recommend that. Next thing you can do is really, get any web security specific tools that you can and just apply it to APIs, because it can find a lot. It's not going to find API specific security vulnerabilities. It's not designed for it. But again, if you can get 30% of the way there with a tool and somebody's time, that's better than getting 0% of the way there, right? Only when you have that initial protection do you then need to go, okay, we need an API security tool, because now we want to go from knowing about our critical APIs to knowing about all APIs. Now we want to go from blocking, security attacks that are really obvious to API specific security attacks. Now it's about, not just having an idea of what APIs are there, but formal risk processes and risk management, really starting to understand what that attack surface both looks like and really what the risk of it is.
So, Katie, we start to wind up the conversation here. What are the questions that security leaders really need to be asking about their API infrastructure? I guess it would start with what's inhibiting my visibility.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. The other good place to start is what APIs do I have? Because I guarantee that nobody in the organization knows. Like, I guarantee it doesn't matter if they're a developer or if they're in security, they just don't know what that looks like. And with that limited visibility, whether that's because, maybe it's like developers are just producing APIs and they don't really care about security controls, whether that's we have some tooling in place, it's not designed for APIs, so it's a problem. It doesn't necessarily matter why you've got that in place. What matters is you trying to understand what that attack surface looks like. It's your unknown unknowns, right? It's the things that you don't know about that may or may not be vulnerable that fundamentally is, I think, the deciding factor of why you need to care about API security. I think on the other side, you should be thinking, what are my critical assets? What am I actually going to be targeted for? If I was under attack by a very sophisticated attacker, not somebody just chancing it, not someone just chancing it with a phishing email or trying to put ransomware and using a known vulnerability, but how could somebody do the most damage to my organization? And I guarantee that will involve APIs in some way, shape, or form.
Well said. We've covered a lot in a short period of time. Katie, where can our viewers go to learn even more about API security?
Absolutely. You can go to traceable.ai. We actually run free API security training. You don't need to be a customer of Traceable. You just need to sign up. They're complete free webinars. We also have our security research team, Aspen, which is made up of some of the best API security researchers in the industry who are always producing new stuff. And if you would like to get a demo of Traceable, there is a link to that on the homepage, and a sales engineer can walk you through the product and really show you how it all comes together.
Very good. Katie, I'm grateful for your time and insight today. Thank you for that. Thank you for answering my questions.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank our attendees as well. We recognize you took time out of your day to attend this session. And I know you're walking away with some excellent new insight on API security. As always, I look forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming sessions. And until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you.